this is our notes over our ecological pyramids that we did in class. If you recall, you had your pyramid and then you had specific instructions on how to color your pyramid and what to do with it. So what we have here is, if you fold it up, we actually have, an actual pyramid. See, if you glued it in your notebook, it folds up and it makes a pyramid, with the point being that the base is much larger than the top. So if we look at this, the organisms on the bottom, this actually represents a lot of things. We're going to look at energy, biomass, numbers. So we're going to look at how this pyramid with the large bottom and the small top applies to multiple things we're going to talk about. Okay, so first we're going to look at energy. And there was a misprint on the notes, which is my fault. And I scribbled it in here and fixed it. So we're going to fix this. Energy. Now, in terms of energy, only 10% of the energy at one level is available to the next level. The rest of the energy is going to be lost to the environment as heat or used up by the organisms for growth and reproduction. So autotrophs make energy, or they make their own food, and they use that for energy. They're going to use 90% of that for growth and reproduction and lose it as heat to the environment. 10% is available for the herbivores to eat when they eat the plants. That's it. Only 10%. And plants are not the only autotrophs or producers. They just happen to be a very large group, so I put them right here. Okay? So they have 100% of the energy, or we can say 1,000 kilocalories. I just made that number up. Whenever the producers get eaten, only 10% of that energy goes to the primary consumers, or 100 kilocalories. And then the secondary consumers get 1%, or 10 kilocalories. And the tertiary consumers only get 0.1% of that energy. So if you think about that, that's 1 kilocalorie. In this whole pyramid right here, so you see why the top is so small? These produce a ton of energy. They use that energy. And then each level is going to use some of that energy and lose it as heat. So the top level has very little energy available to it. Okay? The same thing for biomass, which is the total mass of all the living matter in an ecosystem. And that's going to decrease. Just like the amount of energy gets smaller from level to level, the total amount of living matter gets smaller as you go up as well. So these are just an example, again, numbers I picked out. If you had 809 grams of autotrophs in a square meter, that could only sustain about 37 grams of heterotrophs. Think about the difference there. And some heterotrophs are really large, which is why they have to eat so much. And then the higher level consumers, those actually have to consume a lot. And this is why we don't have a lot of really high level consumers. They just don't have enough organisms below them to support that population. And so you see populations that grow and decrease because sometimes the prey are really numerous, so you have lots of predator, and then when they start to die off, you have fewer predators. They start to starve and die off too. So that fluctuates a lot. And then we have our numbers pyramid, and it is the exact same pyramid based on the same idea. Because less energy is available at each level, you have fewer individuals. Not only do we have less mass, we have fewer individuals. So when you have really, really big herbivores, you have fewer of them. Okay? So for example, we have a lot of plants, but really, comparatively, not that many herbivores because there's not enough energy. And even fewer carnivores, which eat just animals, and fewer omnivores, which will eat plants and animals. And the last idea, I just want to kind of touch on this, is the idea of biological magnification. And that comes back to our pyramid of things, getting smaller as you go up. Now, there are certain toxins, and when they enter an environment, sometimes at the lower levels, the concentration will be very low, and so it's not damaging to that level. However, that concentration increases as you go up through the feeding levels or the trophic levels. So each level, because there's fewer individuals, there's less living matter, the concentration, all those molecules get kind of concentrated or all combined into fewer and fewer individuals. A great example of this is DDT. Years ago, DDT was used as a pesticide, and it entered the food chain at very low levels, and it wasn't very concentrated. As it moved up the trophic levels to insects and then fish and on up, what was happening is that started to get concentrated in the organisms, and we didn't notice its effect until we got to the top. We got to the eagles. And suddenly, because there were very few of them compared to the fish and everything else, this was really, really concentrated. And what happened is it caused them to lay eggs with soft shells. And those shells, because the shells were soft, the eggs didn't survive, and so the reproductive rate became really low. And the number of eagles surviving and reproducing in the wild decreased a lot. And by changing and making DDT illegal, we've noticed that the eagles have started to recover because the ecosystem kind of worked that toxin out. Mercury and ocean life is another one that we see a lot of. And so, there's certain fish you're just not supposed to eat a lot of because of concerns over mercury in the higher trophic levels. Okay. Now, that was our ecological pyramid, and we have it in our notebook. And then on the next page, you answered your questions and include the answers to your questions in. Make sure you answered those questions. Then we're going to talk about our food webs, which kind of go along with this. And you already watched a video over food webs, so we're not going to spend too much time talking about food chains and food webs and, what everything is showing, okay? What I want to talk about is how this relates to our food or our ecological pyramid, okay? So we have our autotrophs or producers down here at the bottom. And then we started talking about primary consumers and secondary consumers and tertiary consumers. Well, an organism's place in the ecological pyramid doesn't always stay necessarily the same. And we can't always call one organism a primary consumer or secondary consumer. Not only do autotrophs, heterotrophs, let me try this again. Not only do omnivores move throughout the levels, even some carnivores. Like we have this grasshopper is a primary consumer because it's feeding on these plants. That makes this frog a secondary consumer because it's feeding on this grasshopper. But over here, the frog eats this dragonfly, which ate this butterfly. So that makes the frog a tertiary consumer. So the terms can, as long as you understand that these are consumers up here, I want you to understand that more than a specific position within the ecological pyramid. Okay, so they can fluctuate a little bit. Although primary consumers, if they're strictly herbivores, they stay here. If you had something that was an omnivore, let's say we had a person, then that person could be considered a primary consumer and a secondary or tertiary consumer, depending on what they're eating. Okay, so they can move throughout the levels. Okay, and they're generally feeding on the organisms in the level below them. And so this shows this as well. This mouse is a primary consumer, and then you have the snake, which is a secondary consumer, and the eagle is a tertiary consumer. So you can kind of see how the food web is really complicated and shows lots and lots of feeding relationships. It also shows competition. So we can see competition between the organisms at the top. We can see competition between organisms at the bottom. So this is going to show us all the interrelated connections between organisms. We can also use a food web to analyze how a change might affect a population. For example, if something happened to the mouse population and all the mice died, what effect might that have on the population? Well, you can bet that the snakes, eagles, and coyotes would be affected because they all feed, or hawk as that is in that case, they all feed on this mouse. So how would that affect that? That would probably be a pretty harmful thing to happen for these up here. And we can also, if we took out the frogs, what would happen? Well, you can probably guess that some of these down here that are eaten by the frog, these populations would go up. So how could that affect an ecosystem? And something we're going to look at in class is when you take away the top predators, what happens to the ecosystem? We used to think, oh, it wasn't a big deal, and you take away the top predators. We now know that causes more problems than it fixes, and it causes more problems than most people expected it to cause. And we'll look at that later. The last thing I want to talk about are decomposers. These are groups of organisms that feed on dead things. They take all of these organisms, and once they die, they recycle those nutrients. They break them down. This is essential. They break those nutrients down, put those nutrients back into the soil so that they can be picked up by the autotrophs, which are going to get eaten by the primary consumers and the higher level consumers. This puts all the nutrients that we have, carbon, nitrogen, everything. These decomposers break that down and put that back into the food web. It goes back into the soil so it can be taken back up. And that's essential, that recycling of those nutrients. The two major groups are bacteria and fungi, like mushrooms, for example. Not the only type of fungus. But those are going to break things down. Fungi are not plants. They feed on other organisms. They're heterotrophs. And some protists are considered decomposers, and there are other organisms that are considered decomposers too, like fly larvae or earthworms. They break those nutrients down and put it back into the soil. Okay, so that's going to go into your notebook too. Fold that up here so you have your title available or title visible right here. And that's all for today. I hope you found that helpful.